which basically means I don't have any important information. These people are the ones that have important information. Before I do any introductions, I want to make a few announcements. The first one is, if you lost your phone, Zen has it. I hope. If you found a white iPhone, please be a good Samaritan and get it to Zen. Or anybody with a green name tag who can get it to Zen. I'm going to make a personal appeal that if you have a bike locked up outside, there was apparently one bike theft because somebody locked up with a cable lock. These are you locked. If you brought your bike from out of town, this is birthday. And now we can get started. So our panelists today are Paul Hoffman, Lisa Chacon, Shannon Biggs, and Tarek Zoe. Now I'm gonna go in first order here. Tarek is a very intelligent engineering professor in the mechanical engineering department, and was responsible for me doing a lot of problem sets my first year at Berkeley. But I know about materials still. So, thank you, Tarek. Shannon is is the director of the Community Rights Program at the Global Exchange. She recently co-authored 2 books, Building the Green Economy and Success Stories from Grassroots. I'm going to let her each of the panelists talk a little bit more about themselves in a minute. So, Lisa is a co-founder at the Hub Oakland, where creative businesses co-grow. Is that the word? Okay. And Paul Hoffman is a civil and human rights attorney based in Venice, California, and the proud father of Katie Hoffman. And I was asked to add that to the introduction. And so now I'm going to have the panelists tell you a little bit about themselves. So, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I've been a lawyer for almost 40 years now, and I do mainly civil rights cases and international human rights cases. I particularly have specialized in bringing international human rights cases against corporations, and I've argued a case in the Supreme Court recently about that. I was an ACLU lawyer for many years and represented environmental activists against SLAPP suits. I've been a teacher in the same amount of time and taught international human rights for about 30 years, and I was the chair of Amnesty's international board here in the United States and internationally.
I'm Lisa Chacon. I have a doctorate in chemistry from this very institution, and that was a little while ago. I'm no longer a practicing chemist. I went on to work in a big company for about 10 years in R&D, doing inventing the type of glass that's in LCD displays and optical fiber. And I had a big transformation in my life after 10 years in that environment. I really became activated in sustainability and climate change and our addiction to fossil fuels, and I made a big change in my life and went to Sweden and studied sustainability and got a master's there with the natural stuff. And since then I've been working, being trained as a scientist, I'm prone to do experiments. So I've done a lot of experiments with my life and my work, and including starting a consulting firm, doing innovation for sustainability. I'll tell you a little bit about that as we go. And I'm currently a co-founder and co-director of Hub Oakland. We're just about to open, and I'll tell you a little more about that too.
Hi, my name is Shannon Biggs, and as you already know, I'm the Community Rights Program Director at Global Exchange, which is an international human rights organization. My background actually came as an economist. My master's is from the London School of Economics and Post-Colonial Development and Empire, where I was working on the theory that the United States and its corporate managers might in fact be a part of a continuing empire, which at the time was a very unpopular idea and notion at that school. I came back to San Francisco State to teach international relations, and I decided that that wasn't something that I really wanted to go out and do some things before I spent too long as a professor in my 20s. So I went to a think tank called the International Forum on Globalization, where I, along with many other organizations, including Global Exchange, helped to bring a lot of understanding to the streets of Seattle for what was later called the Battle of Seattle around the World Trade Organization. And I spent a lot of time at the IFG, at a think tank, also speaking truth to power to places like the United Nations and the WTO and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and really felt, for me, unsatisfied that that's where change was going to come from. So I left about 10 years ago to come to Global Exchange to help spur the grassroots revolution for democracy and really putting government in the hands of the people. And along that road was really the first book that he mentioned was really about a journey of discovery for how is it that we can help communities get what they want in the places where they live, and how can we become truly sustainable as a society in so doing. And what I came to realize was that the thing that was standing in the way of communities, after looking at about 2,000 case studies, wasn't so much the corporations, it wasn't really so much the Walmarts and the Chevrons of the world. It was our own system of law that enables corporations to override community concerns. And if we're going to actually change anything, we actually had to change the way the law worked and who the law serves and benefits. So the work I do now is to assist communities to write new laws that recognize and assert the rights of communities and ecosystems, the rights of nature to exist, to flourish, and to evolve and regenerate their vital cycles, which is currently essentially illegal. So the work I do is to work with communities to pass new laws, to say no to the things that they don't want, to assert their power over, to subordinate corporate claims to those legal protections, and to recognize the rights of ecosystems. 150 communities in the United States have passed these revolutionary new laws to stop things like fracking, toxic sludge spreading, water withdrawal, pesticide spraying, anything you can think of. The work I do now here in California, a lot of it is around fracking, as California begins this fracking for oil boom here, and a lot of communities are hoping to change that and to say no to fracking so that we can open the door to say yes to the things that we do want.
Yes, I'm Tarek Sodi. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering and also the energy engineering division here at Berkeley. And on Berkeley's campus, that's our primary interest, at least among the technology wing these days, is energy conservation, generation, transmission, and so forth. So we started a new degree, actually it's the inaugural class will come in this year, which is primarily interested in educating students on all aspects of energy, generation, transmission, policy, and so forth, primarily because at least the feeling is among many of the tech-type people is that not many engineers or physicists or chemists move into the policy domain in the United States. It's much more prevalent in Europe. So our primary interest is to educate students on all aspects, not simply to become technological idiot savants, but to be able to also manage and understand policy and bring a rational discussion on exactly what these different processes like hydraulic fracturing bring to the table, whether they're viable, whether they're dangerous, and so forth, but in a quantitative and rational way. So I'll stop.
So before we move on to questions, one more small announcement for you all to think about, and a request that you're awesome. That whoever is sitting by the door, when people walk in, they just kind of signal to close it slowly. Thank you. So behind me are all of the breakouts for you to think of after this. So no rush, pay attention to the panel, but they're there for you to think about. I'm going to go through some questions that we've come up with for our panelists in the order that they're on my paper and not the order that they're sitting. So Shannon, we can start with you. Can you please elaborate on the interplay between community rights and the fight against corporate harms? And could you please give some examples?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. As I mentioned, and I'll just use hydrofracking as an example since I've just come back from a statewide tour stopping in about 10 different communities with a bunch of other organizations including 350.org, Food and Water Watch, Clean Water Action, Credo, Earthworks, and others, to educate Californians about what fracking is and what its impact could be for residents here in California. Fracking has obviously, and what they can do about it. With the fracking, I've been working with communities around fracking for many years though, because as a lot of you may know, hydrofracking for gas primarily has been taking place on the East Coast for quite some time. And if any of you have seen the movie Gasland, which Gasland 2 is about to be released, and have heard about the number of people who have been impacted severely by hydrofracking. We were told that hydrofracking for gas is the clean energy of the future. It was a bridge fuel, and what we've come to find out is that everywhere fracking plays happen, that the reality is that people are being told they can't use turn on their water. They can't wash their hands in it because of in the case of methane and other toxic chemicals that are found when they do fracking. The fracking process pours millions of gallons of water and millions of gallons of toxic chemicals deep underground, about 2 miles, and then horizontally to break apart hard shale and to flush all of those toxic chemicals, which also then help bring the natural gas and the oil back up to the surface. The process of fracking and its disposal have caused cancer clusters, livestock deaths, all kinds of organic farming sort of ceases to exist. If you live in fracking, in frack land, and you want to, let's say, refinance your house, the mortgage companies won't touch it because they say your house and your water is absolutely useless, and therefore your property is useless. So from the monetary to the very tangible health, air quality, climate change, from every standpoint, hydrofracking is one of the most dangerous energy production methods on Earth, has been evidenced by communities across the country. And so when it comes time to say what can we do about it, well, fracking, for example, was exempted through something called the Halliburton loophole during the Bush-Cheney administration. Halliburton Corporation, primarily responsible for some of the advances in hydrofracking that are used today. That hydrofracking was so clean that it really didn't even need to be monitored by the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act. And so those regulations were lifted away. So the things that we normally count on regulations to protect us have been lifted away. In California, the ingredients in fracking are protected under trade secrets law. So communities aren't, and even physicians aren't even allowed to find out what those toxic chemicals are, even as they attempt to treat people from exposure to fracking, its waste, and all of the water that it corrupts. And so here in California, fracking is not regulated at all. It's not monitored at all. So when you ask the regulatory agency that monitors oil and gas, DOGGR is the acronym, Department of Geothermal Gas Resources, they'll tell you they don't know where fracking is even happening in California. And yet, with the large shale plays here in California, we're poised to become the #1 oil economy in the United States. We're currently #4. So fracking is positioned to absolutely change the way that Californians live without any say in the process at all. And so for many people, they see fracking as really the deeper issue of a democracy problem. So community rights, the work that I do, is to recognize that the rights of citizens and the rights of residents, not just citizens, the rights of all residents to be safe and secure in the place where they live is the highest priority. And it's certainly the highest priority of law and government, is to protect and promote our own inalienable human rights. And yet, when the government itself lifts away those protections, it's time for us to write new laws. In the same way that Rosa Parks stood up and asserted her rights, or the people at the lunch counters said, we're actually going to come here to this lunch counter and demand to be served. Communities are rising up, and they're using the law in a way that is culturally important, in a way that says something larger than we don't want to just ban fracking. We want to make sure that the role of government and law is to uphold and protect our rights. We want to create democracy in the place where we live, because right now we don't have any. 150 communities have written new laws that recognize and assert their rights. These laws say we as a community are capable of local self-governing and making governing decisions about things that matter to us in the place where we live. Who else but the people that live in a place should determine whether or not fracking happens there? And this is the movement forward. So in terms of these new laws, it's about creating a democratic space in local communities and asserting the rights of the communities and the rights of the ecosystems, and to say, based on these civil rights for communities and nature, we are stripping away the rights, including corporate personhood, the contracts clause, the commerce clause, any tool that corporate frackers, for example, would use to override community concerns, we're not recognizing here. It's our way, it's the community's way of standing on the shoulders of civil rights movements of the past to say we're reclaiming this space and we're reclaiming our communities as a safe place for local government to make important decisions about health, safety, and welfare.
All right, thank you, Shannon. And as part of all of the expertise on this panel, Tariq, if you could speak to how over the past few years there have been many innovations in the energy field. From these innovations, there have been many 10 to 20 to 50 to 100-year plans emerging. Could you give your interpretation of how the energy field will look in these medium to long-term windows?
Unfortunately, I wish I could be more optimistic. Generally, right now, if you look at the percentages of where our energy basket comes from, it's about 28% coal, 43% oil, 23% gas, 6% hydro, 6% nukes, and 1% everything else. So that hasn't changed for a long time. And ever since I was a kid, I grew up in Louisiana, right in the back of Exxon, so to speak, and where they were polluting everything, primarily, unfortunately. I don't know how it is today, but I left many, many years ago. It was also about the same percentage, unfortunately. And we were told, at least in the Carter years, oh, it's going to be quite different in 30 years, and you'll see the difference. There's no difference. I think primarily it's a political issue. It's not really a technological issue of where the energy basket or how it will change is going to happen. For example, nuclear power, which again, we were starting to go in that direction again before Fukushima, is also somewhat of a fantasy. I mean, the reality is that it requires capital upfront costs. I mean, it's basically a social welfare system for an energy company, because the amount of money you have to put in to even start a nuclear plant is daunting. So it's really not a viable resource. Even if it was cheap to make such a plant, we only have roughly 70 to 80 years of uranium even left if we decided to go full bore. So that would also evaporate. So really the only sustainable types of energy that exist are primarily solar. And that is simply of such a low order in terms of the amount that it can generate. Really the onus is going to be on the populace to live with less and to live more sustainable. It's not going to be somehow that we're going to have a magic cornucopia where suddenly we have a lot more energy. The computer revolution is unfortunately driving us even to become more of a consumer type energy nation and planet. I mean, when you think that everyone in this room probably has a cell phone, a laptop, and so forth, those require batteries. And battery technology also was, hyped for many years that was also going to be something that would basically free us from fossil fuels, primarily because what you would do is you would store up a lot of energy locally and then you would use that for transportation and so forth. That also hasn't panned out to any significant amount. In fact, I think it's really produced rather the opposite. We're always continuously charging our batteries, charging our laptops, keeping them on 24/7 overnight. I mean, that drains the grid dramatically. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I think in terms of sustainable types of energy production, really only solar seems to be viable. Solar thermal seems to be viable, and if you really start to look, at least thinking locally in terms of California, every residential home is more or less a local energy producer in theory, right? I mean, if they were to really blanket every roof with solar power and so forth, it would produce a moderate amount of energy. Now, of course, if you feed that back into the grid, you have to deal with PG&E and all of the energy companies that are around California to try to get your money back, in theory, right? So what has happened, though, 100 years ago when Edison, who came out of the winter, so to speak, of all of the different electrical engineers that were evolving roughly 100 years ago, is that his vision was more of a energy producer, some type of a generator of some sort, and then distribution of energy. And that's more or less what was adopted in the United States over many, many years. There was never a thought that each residence would be a producer and give back to the grid. That is very viable now, but it requires really a political will from the state, from governments and so forth, to be able to put things back into the grid and start to decentralize energy production, because that's really going to be key for people to live in a more sustainable way. In terms of some magic or silver bullet, I work on hydraulic fracturing. I don't think it's particularly viable. I wouldn't want it in any residence that I lived in. I think it's impossible to control. It's very dangerous. Shannon probably has even, in my opinion, even sugarcoated how dangerous it is. It's even more dangerous than one would think. I mean, if you look at the fluids that are put in hydraulic fracturing, it's hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, proppants, which are little particles that you have to pump into the ground to keep the fissures open. Once you sort of puff up the ground to let the gas out, you have to put little pebbles in there to keep it open. You also have to put radioactive tracers in there to track where the goodies are, so you can extract them. So this is not a viable approach in the United States, at least in community settings. It perhaps could be viable in some isolated area in the middle of the desert where it could be closely monitored and walled off. In theory, when you look at hydraulic fracturing and things of that sort, you're supposed to encase it in a sarcophagus of cement and concrete and something impermeable. That's impossible in a community. I mean, that's just not going to happen. I mean, your water will it's just not going to be controllable. So in certain isolated cases in the middle of nowhere where no one's living, it could even be, it's possibly feasible. But it's been touted in much of the press that this is the way we're going to have our energy independence. There's no such thing on the horizon. Hydraulic fracturing is not very viable, or it's actually not viable in a community setting. So again, we default back to the only things we really have available are oil, regular fossil fuels, unfortunately, so we have to do a better job of dealing with regular drilling. Coal, which we sit on top of, several hundred years of coal, but unfortunately it's a very dirty substance in terms of burning and so forth. Natural gas, which, has been around for a while, but, is really not going to push the envelope much further. And then we're left with the sustainable basket, which we have not really exploited much at all in terms of solar, hydro, a little bit of biomass. But again, you always see unintended consequences. Biomass, for example, ends up starving people in other countries. I mean, is that a viable approach really for us to take? Probably not. So I'll just simply stop there, but there is a lot of things in the mix that, go into this complex issue. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul, I want to ask you, and this is pertinent to the last discussion, how has the law been used to advance environmental and human rights? Can you speak a little, at a recent case, you argued at the Supreme Court involving Nigerian plaintiffs suing Royal Dutch Shell, and maybe in a short amount of time for the question, yes or no, do you foresee this happening with fracking?
Okay. Let me talk about this from an area of law that I've been working on for quite some time. The question of enforcing international standards, particularly in U.S. courts, and why would one do that? The answer is that the human rights standards in international law and environmental standards in international law are by and large better than our domestic law. And so, as a practicing lawyer representing clients, I have an interest in developing and implementing international law in U.S. courts so that my clients are able to get what they need out of lawsuits. Now, the innovative, and since this is a panel on innovation, the innovation in this particular area was using a statute that was passed in 1789 by the first Congress. It was actually the first piece of legislation that was passed by the Congress in United States history. And it's a statute that says that non-citizens can bring claims for torts committed in violation of the law of nations. That's all it says. And in 1980, a case was brought to vindicate the rights of a father and sister who had their son and brother tortured to death in Paraguay. And they found the person who did it living in Brooklyn. And they were able to bring that case in U.S. courts because they were non-citizens. What happened to their brother was a tort, and it violated the law of nations as the law of nations had developed to that point. 20 years later, we started, that was in 1980, actually about 15 years later. Some of us who had been involved in the original cases, including cases against Ferdinand Marcos, including a case against an Argentine general here in San Francisco who was part of the Dirty War, against a torturer in Atlanta who had tortured 3 women that I represented. We looked around and we thought, well, corporations can cause enormous harm, both environmental and human rights harms, both here and abroad. And they also have power to do good in some situations, so we ought to force them to do good rather than and punish them when they don't. So we thought, well, we've sued these torturers. Why not sue corporations when they're complicit in these human rights violations? And the first case we brought was a case against Unocal, which used to be an oil company that's now been gobbled up by Chevron. But we sued them for a natural gas pipeline project in Burma, and mainly for using forced labor, torture, and extrajudicial execution against the local villagers. But the case had its origins really in the very beginning, starting with the environmental degradation that the project was causing and protest against that. And now, why would we sue corporations? What are the point of this here? Well, one was to compensate victims. That's what you ordinarily sue in tort. One was deterrence, to try to prevent corporations from doing this, or at least imposing cost on them when they do. So that if they're going to be involved in human rights violations, at least acceptance of them by US courts. And we also wanted to act as a catalyst, since litigation doesn't change the world. It's activism that changes the world. It's people power that changes the world. But lawyers sometimes can help. Is that it?
No, I was agreeing.
Oh, okay. Maybe I should stop. So we wanted to act as catalysts for international regulation, and there has been a process at the international level which includes not only human rights but environmental rights that has been inspired in part by this litigation. And let me switch quickly to the case that I was asked to talk about, the Kiobel versus Shell case, which I think is pretty typical of these cases. The case originates out of a movement in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, the Ogoni region of the Niger Delta, from 1992 to the mid-1990s. And it was led by a man named Ken Saro-Wiwa. It was the movement for the survival of the Ogoni people. And basically, Ken Saro-Wiwa led a people's rebellion against Shell and the military dictatorship, where half of the population of Ogoni land, more than 300,000 people, came out to protest Shell being there. Shell was pushed out of Ogoni. It still hasn't come back. But the repressive regime in power then, in cahoots with Shell, led a reign of terror against the people who were associated with Mossad, leading in part to the hanging of the Ogoni Nine, including Ken Saro-Wiwa, in November of 1995. We brought a lawsuit for Ken Saro-Wiwa's family, for the other families of the Ogoni Nine, and we brought, then there was a second lawsuit that was filed for others who had been victimized by this repression in Ogoni land. The first case was settled in 2009 for $15.5 million, which is not a whole lot of money, but at least it established some precedent. The other case went up to the Supreme Court, which, if those of you who haven't been following the Supreme Court, for people like me, is just not a very hospitable forum. And the reason it went up is that a lower court had found that we couldn't sue corporations anymore. That this was a law that we couldn't sue corporations. This is the same courts that say that corporations have First Amendment rights, but when you want to sue them for torturing people, they no longer have any, you can't. And so I argued this case twice. The first time was February of last year, and that was supposed to be about whether corporations could be sued. As soon as I opened my mouth, they said, well, we don't really care about that issue. We want to know whether you can sue for things that happen outside the United States. So they made me argue it again in October. And last week, April 17th, they ruled against me. All 9 of them, actually, which was not very good. Basically they said that they couldn't figure out exactly why I should lose. There were 4 different opinions. All of them thought I should lose, and that my clients who had been forced into the United States, had gotten political asylum here, and had sued Shell because Shell was here, they decided that wasn't enough of a connection to the United States to allow them to bring human rights claims. Now, did they really? The analysis really doesn't matter a lot, because basically is that they just didn't like our case. They don't want us suing corporations. They don't want us holding corporations accountable for human rights violations, for environmental regulations, for all of that. Now, I'll end by saying, does that mean we will stop suing corporations for these things? Well, of course not. That almost goes without saying. We will just, the opinions left us some possibilities of suing US corporations for these kinds of depredations. So we're gonna sue some more of those corporations. There are also a possibility of suing the CEOs and the managers, which actually ought to be a lot of fun, I think. And then we're probably going to bring suits in state courts. So when you talk about innovation, one of the things I think in environmental law, in my experience, but certainly as a human rights lawyer, is that you get hit in the face fairly regularly by the powers that Shannon described, the legal system. The legal system is for the powerful. And when you represent the people that don't have power, you get hit. But every once in a while, you win. You are able to use the system to actually win and to make progress. And usually the times that you win are the times when you have lawyers thinking of innovative strategies that are based on popular movements that use the media effectively, that actually get to some of the decent instincts that people in the society have on some of these issues, and where you can make progress. And so I guess my bottom line point on this is, notwithstanding the fact that none of the justices love me, we'll keep going. And I think that eventually we'll win, and maybe we'll have time to say more about that in the future.
Moving right along, now that we've heard about how evil big corporations are, Lisa, can you, kind of from your context and you're a little bit in the startup space, how can companies leverage creative business models in order to innovate in the sustainability space?
Thank you. Yeah, I was noticing that. I was going to talk about business, and it's just gotten a beating. But I think there really is an opportunity for creative new models. It's really about hacking the system. It's about hacking the business model. It's about hacking the entire system, and that's what we as change makers are up to. And the Hub is a global network of change makers. There are 55 hubs worldwide. There's 6,000 members, people from every sector, discipline, business, nonprofit backgrounds, but all of them share the vision of a better world, a sustainable world. And the hubs are equal parts business incubator, co-working space, community of change makers, and programs and educational workshops, skill shares, et cetera, that help people accelerate their ideas and their innovative ideas into reality. And so I have a few examples of people who are hacking the business model and hacking the system that I thought would be interesting to share. One of them is called Back to the Roots. They're based in Oakland, and they are taking a common theme is taking a waste material, so-called waste, and then viewing that as a resource. So what they did was they get paid to pick up coffee grounds from all the coffee shops, Pete's, Starbucks, etc., and then they use that as a medium for growing really fancy mushrooms on. You've probably seen those packages in the grocery stores. And so that's one example of being resourceful and finding ways to recover waste. Another project that I was involved in, I worked with Coca-Cola several years ago on an extended producer responsibility project where they wanted to figure out, so in Europe and Canada, there are programs that regularly achieve 70 to 80% recovery and recycling of all materials, all wood, even like wood, plastic, paper, aluminum, etc. What we did with them was we facilitated a group of stakeholders that were all across the landscape. People like haulers, people who pick up the trash, local government, the beverage companies who make all the bottles and cans, other packaged goods producers that make cardboard boxes and whatnot. And we mapped the entire system from these multiple perspectives. And we had to have them all in the room because they're all touching a different part of the system. The thing with systems and system change is that there's no one person who can actually change the system. And it is people that can affect systems, decision makers. And what was really amazing was getting all these people in the room from all the different sides and getting them to agree on what the system actually was. And then we mapped it using causal loop diagrams. We mapped flows of material and money. And what you see is that generally when a material changes hands, the money usually goes in the opposite direction. There's sort of a countercurrent flow. I give you money and you give me something. And we were able to find little weird, little sort of non-intuitive things in these diagrams that were a clue, a way in to start changing the system. One of those was noticing that you know, the trash collectors, or the company that picks up the trash, they are getting paid to pick up the trash. And then they can turn around, and when they're picking up recyclable materials, they can actually sell those materials elsewhere. So there's this moment in the diagram where it was like, oh, the money and the stuff are going in the same direction. How interesting. And then using that as a leverage point to create a new program or a new way of working in that system. If I could give one last little example for another company that I worked with, I lived in South Africa for a little while in 2008 and worked with a colleague there. We consulted for a few clients. One of them was a major cement company. They were a subsidiary of Holcim, which is the world's largest cement company. They're headquartered in Switzerland. So we did an innovation session with this company. They were in terrible shape relative to their competitors. They were losing market share. They, you know, the economy had just gone through a big downturn in South Africa. So, and they had just refinanced their company with, you know, a loan from England, and the rand had tanked relative to the pound. So they were just hemorrhaging money on all fronts. And their CEO even announced that he was going to retire. He was like, I'm out of here, this is a mess. And we were called in to help them do an innovation session. And like the day we learned that this leader had resigned, and my partner and I looked at each other and we said, oh my God, like what can we do with these people? Like how can we even help them? This is hopeless. But we went in, we did this innovation session. And basically the way I work is I bring people new frameworks and new perspectives, new frames to look at the same situation from. And we brought in the natural step sustainability principles, we brought in biomimicry, we brought in integral theory, we just took all of these lenses on their current situation and where they wanted to be. And that was it. That was a one-day gig, and we learned about a year later that following that, you know, we had looked at their products, their processes, their markets, their customers. We just examined their entire operation. They ended up developing a cement product that had a carbon footprint that was half of the global average. And they developed a green cement product, which, as you know, cement is a very large producer to CO2 emissions. So there are ways to work with business and to create new businesses that you know, have the potential to transform our systems.
Cool. All right, so I am going to go through and ask all of you a second question. I am going to ask that this question be more bullet point in response, because we're going to adapt a little bit, because I want to leave a lot of time at the end for all of these wonderful folks to ask you some questions. So, bullet point-ish. Okay. And I want to have the audience asking questions in a total of 15 minutes between everyone. Okay. So, Shannon, corporations have a huge influence over energy extraction and intellectual property in the U.S. How can we effectively and creatively counter these issues using community organizing?
So, bullet point, ready, go. I think that the thing is that when we're looking at how change is made and where that energy is, there's certainly there's no real interest on behalf of large corporations to change any of their behavior. They control too much. They have too much power of our legal system, our political system, and certainly of our economic system. So when we are looking at how is it that the individual can change, and it's not just about turning off lights or powering down or all those things. Those are all important. pieces of it. But really, it's about taking control of not just our communities, but to say we live here, and we are part of the ecosystem. There is no such thing as human rights without recognizing the rights for an ecosystem. And so if we're going to make those changes, we actually have to be those that understand those rights come with responsibilities, and that we can take those kinds of the kinds of control to create the kinds of places we want to live. I just worked with Santa Monica, California, to pass the first law recognizing the rights of ecosystems in the state of California. So what they've done as a city who wants to be a sustainable leader and a city that's covered in cement, and I know you said really bullet point, is to say we're actually going to recognize that the ecosystem here has rights. We have a sustainability plan, and we're not going to allow corporations to eat holes in our sustainability plan, because we are going to recognize legal rights for ecosystems. And I would just say, if those were in place everywhere, and the path to that is easy. The very first community that passed rights of nature was Tumaco Borough, Pennsylvania. And it was that law that Ecuador used in looking at including rights of nature in their constitution, now followed by Bolivia and New Zealand and all around the world. So this is something that is gaining traction, and this recognition that we don't, as individuals, have human rights unless we recognize the rights of the ecosystems to exist, to flourish, and to evolve and regenerate their vital cycles. And that is something that people are doing at the community level, as well as saying we have the power as a community to make these laws happen, and we can recreate what it means. We can make sustainability legal, and we can begin to implement the kinds of ideas for how we want business to look in our communities. We can take that control. In fact, it only is going to happen at the community level. It's not going to happen anywhere else.
Thank you.
Sorry.
That was good. Okay. Bullet points. Tarek, how does technological innovation address the need for cultural shift in energy consumption? While you think about that for just a second, I'm going to change the time on this board.
Well, I mean, so at least on Berkeley's campus, I mean, I think one thing that is, you can see this somewhat prevalent, is the fact that soon we'll have to pay our own energy bills, the buildings, things of that sort. And so I think necessity is the mother of invention in many of these regards. So, for example, there's been a big push for the last couple of years on smart buildings. And it turns out that smart buildings really is also sort of an opaque issue, primarily because the buildings become so expensive that they're almost unbuildable, because you have to load them with widgets and gadgets and sensors and wireless RF devices and things of that sort that end up actually using more energy than the building would have if it was stripped of all of those niceties. So I think one area where it's very important to concentrate on is looking at the whole sustainable cycle whenever a technological innovation is occurring, primarily because there are unintended consequences that always occur. So for example, this one item I think that's always been talked about, at least when I have discussions with people over sustainable systems, is the Prius. The Prius is actually less green than the Hummer. It's interesting. First, one has to first preface that question. Is the Prius really greener than the Hummer? So you have to look at the entire life cycle of the device. So number one, you have to mine lithium for lithium-ion batteries in third world countries that are going to be basically enslaved and have slave labor essentially to get that lithium, number one. You have to transport that lithium. You have to then construct a battery, and a battery is an extremely unpleasant device. And one has to be honest, it's filled with acid, it's filled with other types of toxic chemicals that make a battery not a nice thing that after its life cycle is over, you have to bury it somewhere. And you pretty much have to bury it either in a landfill or in some other location that is going to be a problem. So if you really start to look at all of those costs, not from the showroom floor until when you start to go to the gas station, you look and you see that the Prius and devices like the Prius have many hidden things inside of them that make them, from a green point of view for the entire life cycle, less attractive. Almost all of our technological devices that we use contain materials like this. They're rare. They're sometimes called rare earth materials. They have magnets. We need things like neodymium, which is a material that is highly important to find to make these devices function. This requires somewhere someone to mine these types of materials, and they're not very recyclable, so in many cases they have to be disposed of in a landfill and things of that sort. So my main point about this is that whenever we have a technological innovation, like a cell phone, we have to look at the unintended consequences, like everybody charging their cell phones continuously, or having basically the smart meter, for example, is another example that was pushed by PG&E. So the smart meter was supposed to charge you a lot more money during the peak periods of consumption of electricity, during the middle of the day, and so forth. Unfortunately, there were many other strange things that happened with the smart meter, which needed to basically have a wireless communication to be able to track how much energy you're using. So for example, on one building here, a nameless building here in Berkeley, there were many apartments. It's an apartment complex, and there are many smart meters, right? And you have to put them in a grid because you have to track everybody's energy consumption. Unfortunately, having all of those smart meters all together at the same time concentrates the amount of heat buildup and the amount of microwave energy that is concentrated in that location, which leads to spontaneous combustion. So you start to have then accidents that occur, electrical breakdowns, and then all the shrubbery and the trees that are next to that building also have been decimated by the smart meter. So, or so it is alleged. Now, so the question then is, a good intention like the smart meter, which is supposed to regulate and try to control people's urges to consume in the middle of the day, leads towards an unintended consequence of basically becoming potentially very dangerous and harmful to the environment. So I urge that when students get involved in this kind of issue, that they look at the entire life cycle. That is what's most critical, because if you only look at a little snippet of the lifetime of the device or the widget or the innovation, you can, basically make outrageous claims about what it will do or help, in terms of a societal benefit. But if you really look at the entire life cycle, many of our greenest, most wonderful innovations are in fact really not very green at all. And so it's important to look at the entire cycle.
Okay. Thank you. So, Paul. Seeing as how international laws surrounding the environment and human rights evolve separately, how might current and future generations innovate with the law to advance justice, sustainability, and corporate accountability in short form?
In short form, okay. Well, one of the ways, the beginning of the question is that based on the idea that human rights is developed in somewhat stronger ways than international environmental regulation, and I'm talking mainly about international. There are a lot of overlaps between human rights and environmental law that need to be explored. The environmental justice movement has paved the way here in the United States. I think that movement needs to, there are ways of using international law also to advance those interests. I think access to information has been important at every level in enforcing environmental norms and human rights norms. So there's some traditional human rights norms that I think can be used in the environmental struggle. I think one of the other things that needs to be done is the empowerment of local communities around the world, and making sure that people in communities that don't have any power have the ability to stand up for their rights. Right now, that's very difficult. It's more difficult in most places in the world than it is here, and that really needs to change. And one of the hallmarks of the process that's going on about corporate accountability and regulation at the international level is, in fact, empowerment of local communities, and including environmental norms with human rights and labor norms. That process is really at its infancy in my mind, so it's going to take your generation and maybe generations after yours to make it a reality. But I think that certainly those of us that have used litigation as a club have used it mainly to try to inspire the kind of international corporate regulation that really is required if these norms are going to have any meaning in the long run. And also would inspire corporations to do the right thing. And I think this has been talking about, I think that's part of the struggle really, is to get corporations to do the right thing without having to sue them. And the whole, one of the other underpinnings of this John Ruggie process at the United Nations has been to convince corporations that it is better actually to talk to local communities, for example, and try to find ways of avoiding polluting their waters and doing the business that you should be doing without destroying those natural resources beforehand, rather than trying to fight about it afterwards. And I think there can be a lot of progress made in that area.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're making a really great point, and about, you know, the way that our system is set up, something terrible has to happen so that somebody can sue somebody, right? And there are some folks who are trying to do things differently. My consulting firm, Innovive Group, worked with a startup a few years ago called Equitable Origin. And what they're doing is developing a certification standard, much like a fair trade or any sort of a standard for fossil fuel production, so that there would be a way of working with a company in advance to, that they would voluntarily uphold this incredibly high standard for safety, for you know, toxins in the air and the water and the soil, and that and then there's a whole trading mechanism, so they get a certificate for, you know, the oil that's been produced under these standards, and then they can trade that. So this there are some mechanisms that people are exploring that allow companies to do the right thing and be rewarded for it, rather than, you know, so that's more the carrot side of things rather than the stick side of things. And the hope is that this will be preventive, that this process will actually make a difference before some place gets totally destroyed.
Thank you. That was way better than the question I was about to ask. I want to move to the Q&A with the audience. I was about to say, in respective fields, how can students get involved? But actually, I want to let you guys get.
You know, we're like this system has continued to, you know, decimate, like, even like, you know, human livelihood, like, and it's been propped up to serve like the ultimate goal of profit. And why is it still in place? And what gives it like such powerful credibility?
Go.
And this actually, you wanted me to talk about intellectual property, but I'm just going to talk about property. How many of you know that under the eyes of the law that nature and ecosystems are seen as property? A lot of you, that's awesome.
I actually work for a surveyor, that's why I think
Okay.
you thought about that.
Right,
I'm a
okay.
surveyor, yeah.
So one of the things that we're talking about in terms of rights of nature and the power of what does it mean, you know, rights of nature sounds great, but it's actually a really not just innovative, it's a concept that has its roots in indigenous cultures and its eye actually on the law itself, to change the nature of what it means to be property. So, of course, the largest property owners in the world are corporations. And so if we think that we can, I mean, definitely there are lots of ways to help innovate small corporations. But the laws and our environmental regulatory laws, if you look at, let's say, BP, for example, and the Gulf oil spill, when our government goes to put regulations in place around things like deep sea drilling, who do they go to? They're not experts in deep sea drilling. So it is, generally speaking, it's the corporations, the industry to be regulated that helps write the regulations that we then beg our officials to enforce. Of course, a majority of those aren't even enforced. But so here we have an opportunity to look at what is the power of law in shifting culture and shifting our understanding of property. Slaves were once property. Women were once property in the eyes of the law. And that was the law of the land. That was exactly what the law said, absolutely. It takes a shift. It takes people to put things on the line and to force a change in the law. It doesn't take everybody, but it takes maybe, I don't know, let's say the magic number is 10% of people to force a shift that creates a larger cultural awareness. So if we say slavery or abolitionist movement, 30 years to shift a certain kind of consciousness, civil war, to actually make the larger shift. When we make the larger shift that says, oh, we were wrong, those laws were wrong, we can actually put something new in place, then the law actually forces the wider shift to occur. It's this kind of thing that we're looking at in terms of innovation and rights of Mother Earth. How is it that, what does it mean for the environment to have legal rights? It means they have legal standing in a court of law. Imagine if the Gulf Coast ecosystem could sue BP for full restoration of the damage that was caused. Because right now the only people who can sue companies like BP are people who can show damage, property damage, damage to their business or their life, you know. So this is about creating a larger shift that opens the door for new ways of thinking. If we hold the environment and our ecosystems to say, this river has a right to flow and regenerate its vital cycles, then the kinds of decisions that corporations can make are limited, and the kinds of decisions that communities can make about, well, who gets to use that water? Do frackers get to use that water? Do local fisher folk get to use that water? Like, these are the kinds of shifts that we can make by using the kinds of ideas that communities are pushing forward. And that's why I say it's about time we have a responsibility to put ourselves at the table and to say, we demand this change. And actually, we're not waiting for anybody else's opinion to change. We're going to force this change. So in the same way that folks sat at the lunch counters in the civil rights movement and demanded to be served, communities are demanding rights for ecosystems that they can use to shift not only the law, but culture. And this is, I think, the real future of community organizing and the future of environmental justice movement and the future of how are we going to be sustainable? How are we going to connect with the land and connect our human experience and recognize that nature isn't our property to own and do with whatever we want. We have to recognize that our well-being is tied with the well-being of everything else. And we better start acting that way. And it starts at the local community where we care about things and where we can make decisions together.
Right. This man back here was first, and then you.
Hi, my name is Ronan, and I'm from UC Santa Cruz. I study sociology, and first of all, I want to thank you for coming out. This is a very enticing and exciting conversation that you're having. I'm particularly interested in how socio-structural design affects human behavior. And my question is directed towards, I think your name was Tariq?
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure I say that right. I get sort of a bleak outlook when I hear you speak today. So I want to...
Sorry.
No, Don't say sorry. I've been studying this for many years, and I appreciate that. Although I've also studied particularly engineers, engineers like Buckminster Fuller, engineers like Solari out of Arizona, Jacques Fresco. Some of these might be considered as fringe engineers, but who are proven in different industries. And I wonder, is it possible with integrating renewable energy systems, is it possible to actually produce excess abundance of energy to challenge this, this bleak outlook with fossil fuels?
Actually, so it's not bleak if there's a political will in terms of upfront capital costs. So it's just impenetrable. For example, geothermal energy is also impenetrable without huge capital upfront costs. If the same amount of investment is put into solar as it has been for fossil fuels for all of these years, and nuclear power, possibly with fusion, these types of technologies need a huge amount of effort and time spent focusing on trying to develop them to a usable stage. Part of the problem is that we're effectively lazy right now. We have a lot of fossil fuel. Unfortunately, what people have found is that in fact in many regions where they thought the fossil fuels were depleted, many studies have shown now that really is only 10% of the oil that was there, because most of it's really trapped between rock. So then we start to get into the whole fracking and other possibilities in those regards. So people probably will take the lazy way out and attempt to extract from existing resources. However, if the upfront costs are shouldered by the government, and it really has to be a government-sponsored event where they levy taxes on the corporations, which make huge amounts of profits, I think you can take a quantum leap ahead, and in fact many of these renewables are viable. The problem is right now, for 100 years, we've basically focused on oil as our primary source. If we decided tomorrow we're going to focus everything truly on solar, it doesn't require technological innovation, because solar is pretty much tapped out in terms of its technology. It's about now integrating it into the grid. I mean, in a huge way. So I think there's a cultural shift in terms of us, using these other resources for them to become ubiquitous and then to become cost effective. Because right now, they're not cost effective. People simply use them sparingly in any relative sense to other, energy resources. So it's important that there's a push, and it has to be political, to get these technologies integrated in large scale into the system. So when we started, for example, this energy degree a couple of years back, the primary thing was, and it goes back to the previous question, one question ago, which is the credibility issue. All of these kinds of fights are very emotional. They're not quantitative. In many cases, it's a he said, she said, and people just scream, at each other forever. They're simply not going to come to any resolution. What is required is a careful, quantitative analysis of exactly what the situation is to determine the best course of action. And that requires people like chemists and physicists and engineers and material scientists, who normally don't really care about this at all, that have basically a fixation on some technological widget, to get involved in these kinds of issues. We need many more, for example, engineers in this country than is currently available for a country of roughly 310 million people. I mean, relative to how our state of the economy is, we should be mass producing these people, but we shouldn't allow them to stay in their comfort zone, which is basically doing technological innovation. They need to go and become policymakers. And when you look at really the people that are in charge of policy in the United States, they're rarely tech people. They're rarely engineers, they're rarely chemists, they're rarely physicists, and it's the flip side. In Europe, it's far more prevalent. So the question really becomes, why is that? And what do we have to change in our educational system to get these kinds of people that are technologically savvy to also become the policymakers? Because when they understand truly the technology behind it and the physics behind it, it can make rational choices that are, logical, and that are, not irrational based upon profit but based upon an overall optimization of the system, I think everybody benefits. And so this is really a key thing that, again, tech people rarely become policy people. Look at every single one of our presidents for the last N years. Only Carter, who was probably arguably the most energy conscious person of all of the last, presidents, Obama included, he's the only one that was a nuclear engineer. Everybody else has been a lawyer or some other profession that is not necessarily tech-oriented. So it's critical for this to start to become, a common occurrence in politics. So.
Can I, one quick follow-up, really quick? I just want to add, do you see in your department, do you see engineers and architects that are willing to step up and actually
Yes, so
design?
that's what the whole energy engineering degree is about. It's about infusion of risk analysis, policy analysis, with hardcore mathematics and tech stuff,
You need that.
able to become a whole new kind of creature that has not been produced by our educational system ever. So that's critical. But it's not a softy thing. So, I think one of the problems we have, in high school and everything is we really don't like math and physics a lot. And most people want to shy away from it and simply say, well, I'm not good at it. My opinion is you can get good at it if you're motivated and you see a sociological reason that you're really passionate about. You'll learn it and you'll learn how to use it properly. So don't be afraid of it, embrace it, and use it.
Maybe this is the time to pitch my presidency in 2024? Later, we'll take another question. So, you had a question, and then we'll move on to the next few after you.
Yes. My name is Andrew. I'm an alumni at UC Santa Barbara. This question is mostly for Tarek, but I would like to hear Lisa's opinion perspective on this as well. Tarek, you mentioned a case of the Prius versus the Hummer. So if in some cases innovations in reductions in energy use come at another cost, and these could be maybe seen as a zero-sum game in terms of the costs incurred being just moved elsewhere. Do you think that these types of innovations are still worth pursuing, and where do you think that balance is, particularly in moving people's value shifts and consumer preferences with what might be a stopgap or a false solution?
So that's a very good question. It's unclear to me. I think about it all the time. I just bought an iPad, and I thought to myself, is that iPad really green? It uses a lot less energy than my Mac. Perhaps I can use it just, when I need to do certain things. But again, that requires a lot of, labor in another country that's much cheaper, where people potentially are being, not treated to the standards that we would think in the U.S. are commensurate with that kind of work. So the question really becomes, is it really truly a zero-sum game whenever you have a cheaper, better product that we consume, but yet the costs are carried over somewhere else, and we can then, of course, wax philosophically and say, well, they would have never had such a good job anyway if we didn't want our 300 million iPads in this country, so it's better than what the alternative would have been for them. That's not clear to me. I honestly think about it daily in terms of, and there are mathematical models for this. This is not something that is just simply fuzzy, coffee clutch talk. This is basically, we're talking about hardcore models where people are looking at truly are the costs carried over into other countries, and we're simply just putting the burden on someone else and basically hiding the unsavory facts of our consumption. I think the jury is out. It is unclear whether you can really, make a greener product without hurting someone else, intentionally or unintentionally. I don't want to sound, bring up a very famous philosopher from around 1860 that said really there's a finite number of resources, and that really only true wealth can only really be mined. And so if you really ask yourself, there's a finite amount of stuff that can be mined from the ground, and that's truly what wealth is, and all the rest is value added or value reduced, then the answer is it is impossible, and it's a conservative system, and if someone benefits, someone else must lose. And that unfortunately is the ethos of pure capitalism. Whether it's a truism or not is unclear. It's not clear to me whether that's viable, so maybe I'll pass the mic to that.
Well, yeah, I think Tariq is correct in that, you know, there are a lot of negative consequences that are externalized. And so, you know, what's really important is how you define the system. What is the system boundary? Does your system boundary include the factory or, you know, itself? Does it include, you know, the consumer and the producer countries and the system? You know, you can make that boundary bigger to catch those kinds of issues. And I guess, you know, I think I tend to be an optimist, and, you know, there are people who are coming up with, you know, new technologies that use, you know, green chemistry, that use non-toxic materials. There's a lot of effort going in that direction to try to make products that are not toxic and harmful. But I think, you know, so I do have hope in that area. I think there's a bigger piece that I want to touch on as well, that your question got to a little bit, and several folks here have talked about, you know, culture and behavior and innovation and technology and systems. And in fact, change requires, you know, for a change initiative to work, to be successful, to really take something to the next level, it actually does have to take all of those pieces. It does need to, there does need to be awareness. People need to be aware of what's happening, aware of the consequences, aware of the impact somewhere else on the planet. People do need to change their behavior. They need to change their choices, their buying habits, their lifestyle decisions. There is a cultural component to it, because when, you know, you can, I like to use the example of, you know, say you want more people to ride the bus, and you build a new bus line, and that's going to take a certain number of cars off the road. You can add this bus line, but until you address the culture, you won't get people on the bus. So the solution actually requires the system and a culture and some behavior change and some awareness. And I call that the ABCs of social change: awareness, behavior, culture, and systems. So as change makers, we need to really learn how to work on all of these levels. When you do something, you need to pay attention to the ABCs, and you need to be sure that your change initiative is addressing each one of those things somehow. And that, I think, is how we're going to get to systemic change.
Oh, yeah.
I think what Tariq and Lisa talked about is basically what the Supreme Court was dealing with in the case where they ruled against me in Kiobel, and in other cases where we have not been able to impose on corporations in the United States the externalized costs. We sued Walmart, for example, for the way in which the rights of their workers in the supply chain were not being fulfilled, and the courts here refused to deal with that. But the point I really wanted to make is that sometimes legal innovation, like other kinds of innovation, come from elsewhere. And where the legal innovation's coming now in this area, for example, is in the European Union, which has passed a directive which requires parent corporations, requires courts in all of the EU countries to accept cases against parent corporations for what their subsidiaries do outside of the EU. And so the exact case that I brought against, you know, this Shell can be heard in Holland. And in fact, there is a case now, and it's an environmental degradation case involving the Niger Delta against Shell in Holland for things that Shell Nigeria did in the Niger Delta. And you also find incredible jurisprudence coming out of South Africa, the South African Constitutional Court, the Indian Supreme Court, other courts around the world are dealing with these issues in a much broader way than our courts are dealing with them. And in part, I think that's because, you know, the obvious politics in our courts are really controlled by corporations now, to a very large degree. It's a corporatist Supreme Court. Maybe a couple of changes in the court's composition might change that, and maybe our courts would start to accept the innovations from outside the United States. We hope.
So, who was next? I feel like it was you, ma'am, in the blue and black.
Awesome. Okay. I'm Tessa. I'm from Cal Poly SLO, and with regards to hacking the business model, like you mentioned, I was wondering if you could kind of speak to the shared or gifting economies that are kind of popping up. I'm thinking of examples like Lentils as Anything. It's a restaurant in Melbourne, Australia, where they're all volunteers and it's pay as you can afford. Or the story that's been going around with the coffee, where you buy a coffee and you buy one for the next person who comes in and can't afford it. And being in this kind of startup space, how do you gain credibility in that space with that, and how do you actually make money on those models?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think again, there's a lot of experimentation going on, and I'm sure everybody's read Charles Eisenstein's book, Sacred Economies, about sharing, gift economy, and heard about the relationship economy. These are all new innovations, again, that things that really operate at the cultural level, cultural and behavioral level. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I can tell you about one law firm here in Oakland called the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And they offer legal services on a donation basis. The lawyers only pay themselves the median salary for the area that they live in. They don't pay themselves, six-figure salaries, and they're focusing on people who are trying to start cooperatives and time banks and worker-owned businesses. And they're really walking the talk. They're really living a new model and experimenting with new models. So I can't remember the second part of your question. Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Just gaining credibility in the startup space. And
Yeah,
making money.
yeah, and so I think the gaining credibility and making money, those are really good and important things. It's really, it requires creativity, is really, this is the moment for innovation, this is the moment for creativity. For instance, I can actually tell you a story about the SELC, the Sustainable Economies Law Center. They came to Hub Oakland and they said, we really want to have an office in Hub Oakland, but we can't afford to pay the rent. And this was a tragic situation for us with our values and what we want to promote and support, because we actually do have to pay rent to our landlord, and our business won't be sustainable unless we have enough cash to do that and run our operations. But what we actually worked out with them was a way of actually pulling on that generosity gene that you're talking about, the pay it forward when you buy a cup of coffee for the person behind you, or pay for the person behind you in the toll lane. We're running a Kickstarter campaign right now where we're trying to raise $100,000 for our building that we're renovating. And one of the rewards there, or actually there's two rewards that have to do with SELC. One of them is that a donor can pay for their rent in 4-month increments, and that's one of the rewards in our Kickstarter campaign. And the other reward is that they've put up certificates for 1 hour of legal advice. for a certain price, and that money will go to offset their rent. So we took this conundrum, really wanting to help these people who are trying to do things a different way, and we put it out to the community to really see that pay it forward spirit. So we've actually just posted that reward as of yesterday. And you can find our campaign at www.comealivewith.us.
I think we have time for one short question, very tiny. I think you were next.
Okay, my name is Annette. I'm from Humboldt. This question is more for Shannon. I saw Thomas Lindsay speak at the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference in Eugene, and I've been really interested in the whole rights for ecosystems and take away the corporate rights. And so what I'm wondering is, from my understanding, you're taking away the corporations' individual rights and their ability to overturn this new amendment to the Constitution, to the municipal constitution that you're writing. So I'm wondering how corporations are unable to overturn it, and if state courts or federal courts can come back later and overturn that in a Supreme Court setting, or can overturn that in any way.
Yes, really quick. Absolutely, the laws that we're putting in place are new and untested law. We're creating the kind of democracy and government in the hands of the people that we need. These laws are based on the premise that that there is a such thing as local self-governing authority, which under our current system of law, we are mere tenants of the municipality where we live, and therefore can't exercise our rights in that way. And we're saying absolutely we can. And when we talk about stripping corporate constitutional protections, including the Commerce Clause, the Contracts Clause, corporate personhood, state preemption, where the state lifts the ability of communities to make governing decisions, all of these things are about the system putting power in the hands of a small minority of elite decision makers over communities and over ecosystems. So what we're doing is really rather revolutionary. And we are absolutely bucking the law at the state level. We're determining what it is that local communities have the right to do. And state law, federal law, absolutely bring on the challenge. Absolutely, I want to go to court against the corporation or the government that really has the balls to come and say there is no such thing as local self-governing authority, and how dare you begin to pretend that you can subordinate corporate claims to rights and personhood over over ecosystems and communities. So yeah, we're absolutely inviting a fight.
Thank you.
On that note, I would invite you all to thank the panelists with a round of applause.